Today's reading is taken from the book of Daniel, and it's the whole first chapter, and I think probably has some of the trickiest names in the Bible, so bear with me today. And that can be found on page 883. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar; to Hananiah, Shadrach; to Mishael, Meshach; and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favour and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you for that reading, Christine. Apologies. But it's a good reading. Okay, this morning we are coming to, if we can have the first slide up, the third in our series on facing life's challenges. Now, at the beginning of the year, Gilly talked to us about the future, and then Norman talked to us recently about heartache, and I am going to talk to you about compromise. That's a challenge, isn't it? The answer is yes. So, what does it mean? How do we deal with it? And this Old Testament story of the prophet Daniel particularly illustrates the challenges of compromise. And I'm sure many of us came across the story of Daniel when we were young, or we taught it in Sunday school. and had graphic descriptions, very graphic descriptions of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. Or Daniel in the lion's den, both favourite stories for children's books, and I'm not quite sure why sometimes. But there's more to it than that. The whole story of Daniel reminds us that God is sovereign. And even when his people face trials and disasters, he delivers them. And as the book opens in our reading today, we read of the destructive events that happened in Judah. The powerful armies of Babylon had come in. They'd invaded Judah. They'd swept them all aside. They conquered the king, and many of their leading citizens were taken to Babylon. The Jewish people were aghast. They had assumed, they had thought, there would always be a king in Jerusalem, and here was their king being deposed. They couldn't understand why God allowed it. And yet Daniel, we read in the book of Daniel, Daniel seemed to understand that God was in control. He had a bigger picture. So he finds himself picked out as a talented young man, who along with others would learn about the culture and the language of Babylon. The thought was they would go back to Judah eventually and teach them and get them into the culture of Babylon. And amongst this group were Daniel's friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, they faced a dilemma. They were living now in Babylon in a totally alien culture with completely different beliefs and values. The Babylonians worshipped their own gods. What were they going to do? They had three choices. They could get totally absorbed in the culture. They could say, Jerusalem was yesterday. We completely embrace Babylon for today. We will do everything the Babylonians do. We will follow the crowd. And their distinctive Jewish faith and all their Jewishness would just disappear. Or they could take the path of resistance. They could be the revolutionaries, never let themselves get absorbed into the new culture, tell everyone they would never give in. They would fight if necessary, they would speak out loudly, and to be honest, altogether make a real nuisance of themselves in Babylon. Back home would constantly be in their thoughts. They would be extremely patriotic. Daniel and his three friends chose this third path: cooperation without compromise. Cooperation without compromise. They didn't go in assuming everything in Babylon would be terrible. Daniel respected the Babylonians and their culture, and he learned all he could about them, but he never let himself compromise that faith he had or his values. His vision was to impact the Babylonian society for good, not to be absorbed into their culture, not to make such a nuisance of himself they just saw him as a pain and never listened to him. He and his friends cooperated, and they joined this special program offered by the king for greater education. They accepted new names. This meant instead of having names that reflected their Jewish faith, they had names which included reference to Babylon's gods. For example, Daniel means God is my judge, whereas Belteshazzar, his new Babylonian name, means Bel, protect my life, and Bel was one of the Babylonian gods. So, then we hear in that chapter we read, rubber hits the road, as they say. It's always hard when rubber hits the road. Daniel had a problem. He was a Jew. Jews were not supposed to eat pork. They were central values to his faith and his family. So he didn't want to eat this king's meat and this king's wine that he was being given. And so he persuaded the official that they would eat, the four friends would eat a simple diet of vegetables and be healthy. And I'm sure vegetarians amongst us would agree with that you can be very healthy on a vegetable diet. And so it was. And the four friends, they worked hard, they excelled, they did very well. And yet Daniel resolved not to compromise. what he believed was right. God was able to use him, as we read later in the story, in interpreting dreams. And when Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down in front of a golden idol, they were protected by God in that fiery furnace. When Daniel wouldn't compromise his faith when he was told he could not pray to God, he was thrown in the den of lions, and God protected him. So what can we learn from this story of Daniel? Daniel earned respect and integrity amongst the Babylonian rulers he served. However, he never compromised that central core of his faith. Although people tried to stop him, they also recognized that God was with him, and he always gave God the credit for the interpretation of dreams. He wasn't intimidated by the kings and rulers. He wasn't intimidated by what was around him, but he was compassionate and he respected them. How do we think we would have coped in Babylon? Would we have tried to melt into society around us, hoping not to be noticed, keeping a really personal faith inside us, but not letting anything affect what we do, just in case we get into bother? Or would we be revolutionary, setting ourselves apart, speaking out against what was going on, black and white, wrong and right, making ourselves heard, but over time maybe not being heard because we're shouting? Or do we hope we'd be like Daniel, getting involved in the community around us, but having a faith which we won't compromise? It's sometimes a really hard line to tread. I'm not sure how I would have coped in Daniel's position. I hope I wouldn't have compromised my faith. I hope I would have had the strength, but that's easy to say. And I wonder if some of the Jews around Daniel and his friends looked at them and said, "Ooh, they've got names of gods now. Whoa, they're learning about Babylonian culture. Well, they can't be Jews anymore." And yet we know that Daniel knew his God. Some of the dilemmas we have today, it's easy to judge others and not realize what's really going on. So, is all compromise a negative thing? Are there times when compromise works? Well, this was my challenge when I looked up the word compromise. It has two meanings, doesn't it? Firstly, to accept standards that are lower than is desirable, which is actually compromising our faith. But secondly, it's meeting each other halfway. It's coming to an understanding. It's finding a happy medium. So if I want to go out for a walk in the countryside and Graham wants to go to the pub, we go for a country walk and end up at the pub. That can be a compromise. It's give and take. And I won't say which is the best bit. Interestingly, I'm sure many of us have heard the story of Eric Liddell, Chariots of Fire. He didn't want to run on a Sunday because he really believed the Sabbath should be kept for church things, etc. And he had a very strong belief in that. He did, however, run in the 400 meters. He won. He set a record which stood for 12 years. But what a lot of us don't know is that he went on to become a missionary in China. He was interned with a lot of other members of the China Inland Mission, and he was in a really large camp. And there were a lot of difficulties amongst the people in this camp. And one Sunday, Eric Liddell was asked to referee a hockey match because it was really becoming, really difficult. And he did it. And you could say, did he compromise his belief? Or did he compromise in a positive way, saying, I'm going to protect these people, I'm going to referee this properly? So I'm not saying there's any answers to this, but it's walking that line. What we each need to work out as we spend time with God, spend time in His Word, as we share it with each other, is what is at the heart of our faith? What is here that we won't walk over the line? What are the things which we say, that is our faith, That is our belief. This is our God, and I'm not going to walk over the line. And one of the things that helps us with that is a voice of conscience, the Holy Spirit speaking within us. We know, don't we? Well, I know sometimes if I've done something a bit, I wish I hadn't done that, because God speaks. And it's all about listening. It's all about knowing our God. I'm sure many of us have watched dramas in the 18th and 19th, set in the 18th and 19th centuries, where vicars are often depicted as very grim-faced, Mark, who see the world in black and white, preach hellfire and brimstone to everybody. And I don't believe that's what we are called to do when we think about compromise. We don't want to witness to a rigid faith in our God that offends. But we also need the balance that we don't compromise our faith, what we believe in, our core values, our love for a God who loved us enough to die for us. We also want to show that Christians can be joyful, have fun, have laughter at the right time. This doesn't mean that this is easy. Having God-given values and behaviours isn't easy to stick to sometimes. And to be honest, people around us, in our workplace, in our communities, in our families, sometimes have no idea where we're coming from. If we say, well, I don't feel I want to do that, somebody might say, well, I don't know where you're coming from there. We might get comments such as, why would you do that? Or don't spoil it for others. And it's tempting just to melt in, like Daniel could have, and just melt in with everybody else. Just do what they're doing. We're all fallible. And a challenge to us all is, what faith are our children learning from us? Our work colleagues, our friends, our relatives and our neighbours. Do our work colleagues, are they aware we are Christians? Do they respect how we live our lives? Or have we annoyed them so much with the way we are? Or do we just melt back and say, it's only on a Sunday morning? How do we resist compromising our faith then? Instead, living consistent lives with everything that's going on around us. The first thing is courage. We need courage. And Timothy tells us that God did not give us a spirit of timidity, but a spirit of power. Not easy. We all need courage because we make choices every single day. I make a choice as soon as I go out the door, whether I turn right or left. We make a choice with everybody we meet, whether we say something to them, whether we don't, what we say, what we do, where we go, how we act when we're out on an evening. It's all about choices. And where do these choices hit our faith and who we are? They should all, really. The Holy Spirit within us, speaking to us in every part of our lives. Where do we want, like Daniel, to be immovable? We might not always feel this courage, but it is a strength that God gives. And even Daniel really struggled at some points, because in Daniel 4 we read, Daniel was greatly perplexed for a time, and his thoughts terrified him. And yet he went on to meet with the king at that point and tell him what his dreams meant, because he knew God wanted him to do that. We also need courage to be vulnerable, to admit when we're wrong. We don't always get it right, and that takes courage. And we sometimes need courage to be countercultural in our family life, in our relationships, in the workplace, in society, not doing everything everybody else is doing, not saying, well, that's what's happening round about us, so we'll just do it. Each of us seeking God for how he wants it to be for us, how he wants us to live our lives for God. Daniel got involved in that Babylonian community. I really believe in getting out there and into our community. but standing for God. He was respected, and yet I think those around him would have known there was a line over which he would not tread, because he knew and loved his God. Secondly, we need to build endurance. Daniel was in Babylon for many, many years, and it must have been tempting sometimes to say, I've had enough. They've run me down. I'm just fed up. I want to be like everybody else. I'm just going to give in. I'm going to worship their gods. I'm going to be like them. But he didn't. He didn't. He knew his God, a God who kept his promises, who with certainty would not let him down. He had a vision of what God wanted him to do and who he was to God. How many of us have been tempted to give up when it goes on and on and on? Sometimes we're tempted to give up when we have stepped over the line, when we have got it wrong. But you know, we have an amazing God who, if we come to him, if we confess, if we ask for forgiveness, he puts his hand in ours, he stands us up again, and he puts us back on that path. Isn't that amazing? Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes there are consequences to our actions when we get it wrong. But if we come back to that cross, God will walk with us through the hard times as well as the good times. And the great thing about having each other is that in the hard times, we can hold each other up and encourage each other to endure, to keep in there and not to compromise. So we need courage, we need endurance, and lastly, but not least, we need love. Love for each other, seeing people as God sees them, not being hard-hearted and judgmental, but being willing to compromise positively where it doesn't go against our faith. So much of society says, look after number one. We have an amazing opportunity to share our lives with others, to be radical in the way that we show love to each other. It can be tempting sometimes to hold these high ideals and perhaps judge each other until we go through those difficult situations, until we have fallen. Then we really have to pray and work out what we do believe and think through situations, and where the amazing love of God comes into it as well. So as we come to worship together, let's spend some time letting God speak to us about where we might have compromised our faith in a negative way, where we have stepped over that line, perhaps wanted to blend in too much, fitting into the crowd. God is a forgiving God. And if we come to him, we can receive his forgiveness. We can ask for that courage, ask for that perseverance, ask for that love for all as we work out our God-given values and beliefs. And is God also speaking to us about the times we dig our heels in? We're not willing to give in. We're not willing to give and take in our relationships, in our work. Blow over us. Let us receive his forgiveness and let ourselves be transformed by him. Daniel was a stranger in a foreign land. He worshipped his God with just a few friends, and yet his integrity, his standing in his community was clear. And when it came to the choice between his love for and his worship for his God, or doing what the Babylonians wanted to worship their God, there was no contest. He was willing to positively compromise. He took on a Babylonian name. He learned about their culture, but he would not compromise his core faith in God. He had courage. He had endurance. He had a love for all those around him. He knew his God. Do we?